let's get straight on. To introduce today's speaker, I'm very pleased to ask Scott Frickel to do so. He is the Boeing Distinguished Professor in Environmental Sociology and Associate Professor of Sociology here at WSU. So, Scott, I'll let you take this away. Thank you.
So Dr. Wells, who's speaking today, is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of South Florida. There he served as Founding Director of the Office of Sustainability and as Deputy Director of the Patel School of Global Sustainability. Professor Wells is an environmental archaeologist whose interests include the social and environmental consequences of global tourism, complex systems dynamics, outcome-driven sustainability science, human impacts on soils and landscapes, and quantitative modeling of environmental science data. Over the past 15 years or so, Dr. Wells has undertaken field research in Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, and the United States, and he's funded those projects with the monies from the National Science Foundation, the Winter Gren Foundation, the National Geographic Society, and other agencies. Currently, he is co-principal investigator on a large $3.9 million NSF-funded project that examines the relationship of tourism and, to coastal health in communities throughout the Caribbean. In 2011, he was awarded the Black Bear Award by the Sierra Club of Tampa Bay in recognition of his outstanding dedication to sustainability and the environment. Wells has written or edited several books and special issues of journals, as well as many other articles, chapters, and reviews. He's with us today to speak on the topic of culture and sustainable development policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wells.
Thank you. That was very nice. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm from the Midwest, so we have a different sensibility, I suppose, different worldview. So how are you?
Good.
How's the pizza? Excellent. That's what you come for, right? So I very much appreciate Dr. Frickel's introduction. That's very nice of you to say. And thanks very much to Dr. Elgar for hosting this and putting this together. And thanks very much to all of you for coming and spending a little bit of your afternoon with me. I really appreciate it. This is my first time in Washington State, really my first time on the West Coast of the United States. So it's like an alien landscape when I landed. And I'm originally from Chicago, but I'm coming to Washington State University via the University of South Florida, where I've worked in the anthropology department for the past 10 years. So I don't have any warm coats or anything like that at all. So I got off the plane in a light polo shirt. I almost wore shorts, but then I decided not to at the last minute, and I'm very glad. It's a little chilly out, but some people, I guess, say that this is nice weather. So we'll see. Today I'm going to be speaking about culture and the ways in which folks in my discipline, in the discipline of anthropology, are integrating the notion of culture into what is called, or increasingly being called, research-based or evidence-based policy. And I'm going to talk particularly about some of the research that I've done with regard to embedding cultural and historical analyses into research-based policy, particularly for sustainable development. Much of my research, I keep forgetting that there's a group of people over here, so I have to turn this way as well. Much of my research has been in the area of global tourism. And so I work with colleagues in many different departments doing kind of interdisciplinary, very interdisciplinary research on the impacts of global tourism to natural resources and natural resource management, as well as cultural resources and cultural resource management, archaeological sites, heritage, and those sorts of things. So before I get to the matter of just sort of this research example that we've been working on the past few years at USF, if you allow me to take a short little diversion and explain, unpack this title a little bit and explain what I mean by culture and about research-based policy, and tell you a little bit about what anthropologists and social scientists do. As I understand it, many of you are not necessarily engaged with the field of anthropology majors, probably more political science. Yes? No? Maybe? Well, good. Maybe I'll keep it but I'll keep it brief. But I'll also encourage you very much to interrupt me at any time and ask questions, because when we get to the heart of the case study, I'm going to unfortunately have a lot of jargon that's specific to my discipline. And so just shout out, what are you talking about? What do you mean? I'm happy to stop and explain. So let me just tell you very quickly what I mean by culture. It is not what many people think in terms of culture. If I ask my undergraduate students, for example, their immediate reaction is, well, fine art and classical music. That's culture, right? But for anthropologists, culture means studying this collection of values and beliefs and ideas and ideals that a group of people share, and how that collection of ideas and values and beliefs influences people's behavior and influences the way that they express those ideals and beliefs, particularly in material culture, but also in other forms of expression like song or dance or artistic expression, but in many of those kinds of expressions. So when I say culture, I really mean looking at people's worldviews, people's values and beliefs, and how that influences their behavior. And this is the stuff of anthropology as a discipline. And this is a great example of culture. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? This is a contrast of worldviews, and this is the stuff of anthropology. And then what I mean by research-based policy is turning to the Bible, for example, to come up with solutions to climate change. No, that's not what I mean. Research-based policy, I'm talking about policy that's based on scientific research, evidence from scientific research, as opposed to policies that are developed for ideological reasons or based from one's ideologies, one's party, one's party affiliation, or one's values or beliefs. I think there's an important role for ideologically based policies, but the kind of policy that I'm talking about is research-based. And so the policies that my research group tends to focus on are those that examine the management of natural resources, for example, urban planning. Sometimes we get into education reform or public health issues. And so these are the kinds of policies that I'm talking about, evidence-based or research-based policies. It's Friday and no one's laughing at my cartoons yet. This is not good. This is not good. I'll just motor on. This notion of research-based or evidence-based policy, particularly in the field of social and behavioral sciences, has been in the news a lot lately over the past couple of months. This is a joint statement from the White House, the director of the OMB, director of Domestic Policy Council, Office of Science Technology Policy, and Council of Economic Affairs, a joint statement issued in July of this year announcing a new initiative, a new White House initiative called the Social and Behavioral Sciences Initiative. And the idea is to examine scientific research, particularly in academic institutions, the academy, and sort of mine the research that's going on in our colleges and universities as a source of evidence to base policy decisions on. And this is a new initiative that is not necessarily incorporating specifically social and behavioral scientists, but it's making use of social behavioral science research in academic institutions. So for what I think is the first time that I'm aware of in the nation's history, the White House is saying to universities, particularly to anthropology and sociology departments, hey, this is your chance. You can really make a difference and have a huge impact. What's the research that you're doing? And so right now, as I understand it, this initiative is looking at existing research that's been done over the past decade, but this is really an opportunity for academic institutions to begin to form new research designs and new research studies that respond specifically to this initiative. This is an opportunity to make a really big impact on the national level. And so one of the things that we're doing at the University of South Florida is putting together interdisciplinary research teams that embed anthropologists and sociologists, psychologists and economists and other social and behavioral sciences onto these research teams and start to explore the ways that social science research can impact these interdisciplinary projects. I just thought I'd take a quick diversion here and tell you about one of the projects that this initiative is focusing on right now. It's called the 30 million word gap. Have you heard of this? This is research coming out of Rice University over the past 10 years, where a group of social and behavioral scientists have studied children up to the age of 10. And they found that a child from a high-income family will experience 30 million more words within the first 4 years of life than a child from a low-income family. And on assessments that they've done, and they've tracked student learning and assessments, they've found that by the age of 9 or 10, those with much higher vocabulary levels at a much earlier age are outperforming the children that have much lower vocabulary at age of 3 and age of 4. So this is a really significant finding in social and behavioral sciences that's now making an impact on policy development, particularly education policy development. One of the outcomes of this study is a series of interventions in elementary school for students. They're experimenting with new technologies, these little smart pads or smart devices that work to increase student vocabulary at very young ages. So they're evaluating, with hard science data, evaluating the efficacy of these new kinds of technologies to address this 30 million word gap problem. So it's really fascinating, exciting research that's going on. And clearly, this particular White House initiative understands the value of social and behavioral science. Meanwhile, in the great state of Florida, our illustrious governor, Governor Scott, has said Florida doesn't need any more anthropology majors. We don't need any more anthropologists. Maybe just because the White House said they need more, so I don't know, maybe not. Of course, it turns out a week later, after he came out with this statement, and the American Anthropological Association responded, our department put together a formal response. It was great publicity for anthropology in Florida and throughout the U.S. But of course, a week after he had this statement in the press, it has been revealed that his daughter, who went to William and Mary, majored in anthropology and couldn't get a job, and so no anthropologist can get jobs. So she went on to get her MBA, just like Dad. But what is of interest in this debate that's sort of emerged over the past couple of years in the state of Florida is something else that the governor said. He said, we don't really want to support social and behavioral science research because you can't really get a job in it. Instead, I want to spend our money getting people science, technology, engineering, and math degrees. These are the STEM degrees, right? So this kind of confused us, this part of the statement, because it's been our impression and understanding that anthropology is very much a STEM science. The kind of science that we do is called social science, but it's very much making use of the scientific method, using empirical data, our observations, to draw inferences. So just a quick look. Nationally and in Florida, National Science Foundation says yes, anthropology is a STEM field. U.S. Customs and Immigration says no. The White House advisors say, kind of. Of course, our governor has said no. Florida Academy of Sciences has said yes. The Florida Board of Governors that oversees public education in the state of Florida has said no. But the chancellor of Florida Public Universities, the head of the Florida Board of Governors, has said yes. So there appears to be a great deal of confusion as to where anthropology in particular fits in to STEM research and STEM fields. And it's not just a polemic. It's not just a debate about terminology and this sort of thing. It has real consequences, at least in the state of Florida, because currently there are special resources, human and financial, but mostly financial resources, that are being set aside specifically for STEM degrees as defined by the Office of the Governor. And so if anthropologists want to benefit from those STEM resources that are being set aside and that are being influenced in K-12 education also in the state, then we need to be very clear as anthropologists and as social and behavioral scientists what we do and how we fit in to STEM science. So if you'll just let me take one more diversion. I know I'm kind of meandering, but I'll get there. And just tell you, from my understanding, what social science is and how it fits into STEM research. Do you consider political science a social science? Okay, then we're on the same page. So this should be old hat for you. So at least from an anthropological perspective, social science, and this is where the tricky stuff happens. This is why people are wondering if anthropology fits into STEM. Anthropologists view, social science views reality as socially constructed. All right, so what that means is meaning is intersubjective and constituted through materiality. Now that's a lot of jargon, and you can start asking questions. What the heck do you mean? What this means is that how we understand and interpret each other's behavior and draw meaning from that, or draw meaning from the environment, or draw meaning from stuff in the economy, it's intersubjective. That meaning is a consensus that's shared among a group of people. In sort of anthropological parlance, you might call it a culture. Meaning is culturally subjective. It's intersubjective. It's shared. And then that meaning is constituted through materiality. So it's given concrete shape through the material items that we produce, that we trade, that we sell, that we buy, that we consume. So if reality is socially constructed, then reflexivity becomes really important for situating alternative narratives about what reality is and how reality is socially constructed. And what I mean by reflexivity is simply being very honest and bringing to the table who you are, what your cultural background is, what your history is, and how that has created your own worldview and your own take on understanding meaning. And so what we end up with in social science a lot of times are stories. They are stories constructed by scientists that talk to people and try to understand what cultural norms are, but by sampling certain populations within that group. So this is where social science people say, is this really STEM related? And that's because we view the reality around us as being socially constituted, as being shared, as meaning is being shared. This is very different from physical sciences, right? Like physics, where meaning comes from nature. Gravity exists apart from humanity. And so the units of analysis that physical scientists study are phenomena that are quite different than human behavior.
Their reality is socially constructed too, they just don't realize it.
Thank you. I wouldn't argue with a physicist but that's how I feel. Methodologically, though, social scientists use complementary epistemologies. By epistemology, I mean, how do you know what you know? How do you know that things are the way they are? And we tend to use in social science two different models of science. One based on Darwinism, and by Darwinism I mean a biological model of science where we study patterns and processes and how those patterns and processes change. That's very different from scientism, which we also use sometimes. That's a physicalist model of science that takes a nomothetic approach, the approach being a search for general law-like generalizations that you can make, regardless of human behavior and intersubjective meaning. So we use both of these methodologies, a Darwinist and a scientism model of science, to understand and unpack these kinds of social challenges. And that's what really makes us more of a traditional STEM science. In Darwinism, a biological approach, the focus is on studying qualities of ecosystems, qualities of biological systems. And so we derive qualitative data from that. In a physicalist model, the focus is on quantities. And so we derive quantitative analysis. So we often use mixed methods approaches that integrate qualitative and quantitative kinds of studies, or instrumental and ethnographic kinds of data. Finally, I think a lot of social scientists, especially today, emphasizes pragmatism, particularly American pragmatism. And by pragmatism, I mean a notion of anti-determinism and at the same time, pro-pluralism. Social scientists recognize that there are multiple pathways that can produce similar results. And our job as scientists is to evaluate all of those different possibilities, rule out those that don't really make sense or aren't really supported by the data, and support those that do make sense. At the same time, pragmatists emphasize empirical observations. So this is using our senses, maybe using some type of instrumentation to make observations, and then drawing inferences from those observations. That's empirical science. And then finally, I think a lot of social science research is increasingly becoming outcome-driven, done for a purpose, applied, working with stakeholders and communities to deal with problems that we have in the here and now. All right. Last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of anthropology and social science research, particularly in anthropology, are the kinds of analyses that we do and how that's brought to bear on these larger issues. And I just want to mention cultural and historical analysis, because this is really the bread and butter of anthropology, cultural and historical analysis. By cultural analysis, I've already mentioned what culture is and how we might approach it and how we might approach meaning. But one example that I thought I would provide are these 3 different worldviews of sustainability. This is the cultural analysis part. Anthropologists study culture and study what people think about the world, their worldview, and how that worldview influences or sometimes constrains their behavior. And what's become increasingly popular in policy discourse is this notion of sustainability. And there are a number of different worldviews that consider sustainability. Some of you have maybe have seen sustainability worldview is represented by these Venn diagrams, these little circles that overlap or compete with each other. So in the early part of the last century, if you looked at notions or worldviews of sustainability, there was the predominant thinking was what I would call an economist model that emphasized the economy at the expense of society and environment. But an important turn happened in the late 70s, early 80s, particularly in, and I think a lot of it had to do with influence from political science, but this was at the United Nations level when governments were trying to figure out how do we work together, how do we continue to exploit resources and not run ourselves out of business. And so this sort of worldview of sustainability developed. And this is one that emerged from the Brundtland Commission from the United Nations back in the early 1980s. And it shows a little bit different view. In this view, economy is just as big and just as important as society and environment. And those interested in the notion of sustainable development pointed to, let's see if I can get it, the intersection here where society, economy, and environment overlap. And it's that juncture where you can have sustainable development that protects our resources for the future but still allows us to go on going on as we do today. Well, recently, mostly in ecosystems research, another paradigm, another worldview has emerged, and it looks kind of like this. Now the 3 circles they kind of look like a target. So in this worldview, economy is seen as being embedded in society because economy is made by people. It is not like the Adam Smith view that economy exists apart from society. You know, the invisible hand of the economy. Markets are these things that are outside of human reach. Here, economy is fully embedded in society, and society and economy themselves are part of a larger ecological or environmental context. So if we, as anthropologists, study people or policies that have these different worldviews, the outcomes for policy research are really very significant. If you just look at natural resource conservation or resource management, policies that might emerge from development thinking view humans, as potentially apart from the environment. And in systems thinking, humans are a part of the environment. And so every single consequence of every single behavior that you engage in has environmental consequences. And in this worldview, there are some behaviors that we have that don't have environmental or economic consequences. It's a very different way of viewing the world, and it results, I would argue, in very different kinds of policymaking, very, very different kinds of behavior. So the simple version of that very long-winded explanation is the way you think the world exists or should exist influences your behavior, influences how you interact with the world. And this has really important implications for natural resource management, urban planning, education reform, and so on. So this is the bread and butter of cultural analysis, understanding what those worldviews are and then understanding how they influence people's behavior. The historical part of this analysis is a recognition of the value of a deep time perspective, a recognition that our environment today, the way we structure society in the United States today, it all has historical legacies. We're all a product of past interactions and past human environmental interactions, and we really need to recognize that. So if you look at environmental projections, and this is just a simple model based on the blue line is instrumental data and the black dashed line is a projection based on these data. And it makes quite good sense. You have a line going up and keep projecting going up. And if you look at environmental research up until probably the 1980s and maybe even in some sectors in geography up until the 1990s, a lot of environmental projections, particularly with regard to human-environmental interactions were based on instrumental data. So they're based on data that are collected by instruments. Thermometer, for example, is an instrument designed to collect information about temperature, right? So a lot of the data was instrumental. And because the instruments that we have only go back about 100 or maybe 200 years at best, our projections are based on a very limited time span. When you consider a deep time perspective, an historical perspective, you get a little bit more of the picture. And you can see where we stand relative to much larger cycles and trends. So there's a real value in understanding deep time historical approaches particularly for projections and trajectories of current environments. So that's what I mean by historical analysis. All right. So in sum, and to introduce sort of this case study that I'll present very quickly, the research team that I lead at the University of South Florida, we seek to integrate this cultural and historical analysis that I just talked about into interdisciplinary research on coupled socio-natural systems, on issues of human-environmental relationships. And we do so with the goal of hopefully contributing to evidence-based policy for sustainable development. And in my research lab, we focus particularly on the impacts of global tourism. The emphasis on our work is on the efficacy of co-management strategies in particular. And by co-management, I mean governmental institutions working collaboratively with non-governmental institutions, nonprofit agencies and organizations. Co-management strategies to manage cultural and natural resources. And to do this, we've been working for the past 10 years on longitudinal research at 4 different research sites, primarily in Caribbean coastal settings, that have very different developmental trajectories with regard to tourism. And I want to introduce you to just one of those research sites and a little bit of the research that we've done so you can get a sense of the value of integrating cultural and historical analysis into interdisciplinary research. And it's very difficult work to work in Caribbean coastal settings. I discovered this, and I'm like, this is the way you're supposed to do research. Prior to that, I was doing research in the middle of the Petén or in rather unhospitable places on a hammock, and no, the coast is where you need to be. And tourism research, you have to do participant observation at resorts. It's terrific. Some of our best informants are at bars and restaurants where you can have really good conversations. You don't remember the conversations, but you can have those good conversations. So our primary research areas are in Tampa Bay. That's where the University of South Florida is located. And then we have research in Mexico at a little coastal community called Progreso, just north of Merida, for those of you who've been there. This is an area that is just developing over the past year and aiming new development, infrastructure development, specifically for tourism. So they're very young in terms of tourism. We're also working in Plasencia, Belize. This is on the coast of Belize, and it is a very interesting case where a hurricane back in 2001, Hurricane Iris, completely devastated 95% of the buildings, roads, everything. Everyone lost everything. People came together and said, we want to rebuild, but the fishing industry isn't going so well, so let's rebuild for tourism. And so for the past 10 years, they've emphasized building and development specifically with an eye toward tourism. So we get a very interesting perspective on rapid development following an environmental disaster. And then finally, we've also been working on Roatan Island. And probably many of you are more familiar with Roatan Island. This is where Carnival Cruise docks. And this is where you go to do scuba diving, and there are coral reefs. And this is at the far eastern end of one of the longest coral reefs in the world. It's a really beautiful area. And they've been developing in tourism for about 25 years now. So these are very different developmental trajectories. Although they've only had mass tourism from Carnival Cruises and cruise ships for the past 3 years. And we've been monitoring extraordinary environmental impacts. And not just environmental impacts that undercut tourism and the value of tourism, but also to cultural resources, to archaeological sites and heritage resources. Roatan, and maybe I'll speak another day, some other time, about Roatan, but it was the southernmost hub of the pirate route. And so there's a lot of pirate sites, and you can make a lot of pirate jokes. And I have some, but I won't share them with you. Last thing I'll say, though, is happy World Tourism Day. The UN World Tourism Organization has designated, for some reason, September 27th, that's today, right, as World Tourism Day every year. And so their focus this year is on tourism and water. And that happens to be one of the main research areas that this research program that I'm involved in focuses on, is tourism and water. So we have two concepts that frame most of our research at all four of these sites. One is the notion of ecological resiliency. And that's simply the adaptive capacity of a system, the ability of a system, a community, to bounce back from something that happens to them. In the case of Placencia, Belize, it was the adaptive capacity of that community to bounce back after Hurricane Iris wiped out a lot of the infrastructure. In the Tampa Bay, Florida case that I'm going to be focusing on, the adaptive capacity of that community we're measuring with regard to sea level, long-term sea level rise. And that's a long-term sort of diachronic property of a complex system, is its resiliency, something that goes on over and over. The other property that we look at is a synchronic property of a complex system that we call urban metabolism. And that's simply a model of the flows of resources and wastes into and out of a system. So we can construct metabolic models for these systems and place them at different points along the trajectory of resiliency, of the degree to which their different communities are resilient. So because of time, I'm just going to show very quickly one aspect of our project in the Tampa Bay area on resiliency and one aspect of the project on urban metabolism, to give you a sense of the role of cultural and historical analysis in these. So this is a map. If you don't know where Tampa is, many people have probably been to Tampa but not stayed there, because this is the place that you fly into to then drive to Orlando to go to Disney. Although you probably have Disney on the West Coast here too. So, at any rate, we have 3 of the top 10 beaches in the U.S., so at least you have to come and visit the beaches. But it's the largest, this is the Tampa Bay metropolitan area and its watershed, and this is the Tampa Bay itself, the sort of bifurcated lobe. It's the largest freshwater estuary in the state and the largest in the entire southeastern United States. It's a very special ecological context for the environment. And just a note about population, the Tampa Bay area was formally settled by Europeans or Euro-Americans in the late 1800s, but just really since the 1940s, there's been an incredible explosion of population. And here is just a population chart so that you can see since 1900, the population of the U.S. has doubled, and the population of Florida has gone up 10 times as much. So a lot of people in a really small area in a rather short period of time, geologically a short period of time. You can imagine has certain environmental consequences. But this rapid period of rapid growth is not altogether new. Back around AD 1000, the Tocobaga Native Americans that populated this area also had a period of rapid growth in about an interval of about 100 years. Populations did not move into the tens of millions like in Tampa today, but they moved into the tens of thousands, and there were about 50 to 75,000 Tocobaga living uniquely in coastal environments. They were not large-scale agriculturalists. Instead, they took advantage of coastal resources. And so you can imagine what it would be like to have, all of a sudden to go from few scattered populations to tens of thousands of people relying on a limited set of fragile coastal resources. So it's a really unique environmental setting that's been impacted twice, at least, in its history in terms of rapid population growth. And those are some of the things that we're looking at. So the resiliency part of the project that we've been working on has been funded by the USGS and an NSF archaeology program grant. Archaeology, this is the historical part of the analysis. Archaeologists, Indiana Jones, the whole, no. Archaeologists study culture, but over the long term behavior. And so some of the archaeology that we've been doing is to go and discover through development the locations of the settlements of the Tocobaga in the Tampa Bay area. And we have been conducting excavations at a number of these. These are represented on the map by these white circles. And through excavation, recovering fragments of charcoal. that we can use radiocarbon dating and obtain a really specific date for the time that that settlement was occupied and different things that happened to that settlement. And so we've constructed a radiocarbon dating curve for the Tampa Bay region from all of these Tocobaga sites so that we can piece together who lived there, how many people lived there, and what were their impacts on the environment. We've also gone into the bay itself and used either a vibrocore or a push core and pushed these coring devices into the bay and collected columns of sediment and then picked them apart and analyzed the different soils, different lithology. We have taken, found fossil shells, foraminifera, ostracodes, pollen, and phytolith, and reconstructed the environmental history of the bay. And there are sequences in these columns that show increased levels of sedimentation that we're able to associate with runoff and deforestation. And there are other sections of these sediment cores that we can use as proxies for understanding sea level rise over different periods. So we've reconstructed the settlement history and the environmental history of the Tampa Bay area through this archaeological approach. And what we found, in many cases, we're able to reconstruct sea level rise over a long period of time, and these are sea level curves at a couple of our research stations, and correlate them. These are radiocarbon dates of some of the settlements. And we can see, for example, that around AD 1 to about 450, during a period of high sea level, that there was beginnings of a large population that grew in the Tampa Bay area. You see there are no radiocarbon dates during this period of low sea level when sea levels dropped about a full meter. But then when sea level rose again and the natural resources of the wetlands and the coastal environment changed, then we have a long span of occupation and very high population density between about 800 and 1400. So from these post-glacial sea level sediment cores, we're able to reconstruct a period of major environmental change about 7,000 years ago when there was no Tampa Bay. There were only shallow lagoons and wetland environments. And around 7,000, around 5,000 BC, that's when sea level rise created what we know today as the Tampa Bay and inundated many of those low-lying wetland areas. Around AD 450, during the drier Van Dahl minimum, sea level in the bay drops up to a meter and drastically alters the marine ecology, pretty much not killing off the existing population that inhabited the area, but changing their ecological base so much that they had to reorganize on the landscape, and many of them fled south into the area of a competing chiefdom, the Calusa Native Americans. So there was that was the response to the alterations in sea level. So from all of this, now this is a very interesting story, a very interesting history of people and the environment, but what is the value of this for today, and what is the value of this for policy? Well, from this long-term reconstruction of human environmental interactions in the Tampa Bay area, we've developed a probability model of sea level rise over the next 50, 100, and 200 years. And you can see it's kind of a little bit small, but you can see what those projections are, and these are in terms of inches of sea level rise. So by the time my oldest daughter, who's 10 years old now, by the time that she goes to retire, she's going to want to move inland and high ground because the coast is going to be inundated. We've used these sea level projections, sea level rise projections, and this is based on that those long-term sediment cores. And we've worked with geographers to create a GIS of the Tampa Bay area, and so we can see physically what would 1 meter, or about 3.3 feet rise in sea level look like in the Tampa Bay area. And I don't know if anybody has been to the Tampa area and you're familiar with it, but this is the area of St. Petersburg, wonderful retirement community, and it is no more. And this is projected in about 100 years. And you can see MacDill Air Force Base. It's having some problems. MacDill is the big Air Force base. This is where CENTCOM is located, U.S. CENTCOM. It is the center of intelligence for the Gulf War and for many other And you can see downtown Tampa. Here's a close-up of downtown Tampa. And the $20 million that downtown just invested in the Riverwalk is for nothing. Fools. We tried to tell them. 20 million. Go ahead. The problem just isn't sea level rise, though. The problem in coastal areas is storm surge. So when hurricanes blow in, it whips up the sea higher than it is when there's not a storm. And so if we look at a storm surge, you can see that almost all of the St. Pete Peninsula is now forming into little islands. All of MacDill and CENTCOM is gone. All of downtown Tampa is gone. The Tampa airports are gone. So one big storm in 100 years will certainly wipe out a lot that exists there today. And that is our conservative projection, is 3 feet. A less conservative projection is a 2-meter rise. And this is a 2-meter rise with a storm surge of about 3 feet. And you can see there's just nothing left of Tampa Bay at all, really. So we've been creating these models and trying to do it in a visual way that people can understand. And so we've also been, though, creating a series of threat matrices. What does this mean in terms of urban flooding, in terms of storm surge and sea level rise? And this is a generic one, but we've created these for all of the different city governments and county governments in the area so that they can get a sense of time scale, probability, consequence, and the geographical extent of sea level rise in this area. And we've also started to work with folks in civil engineering to look at the potential impacts on public utilities. And this is the time that it's going to be really very critical. With sea level rise, you know it's kind of slow. You can see it coming. You can move and get out of the way. But the long-term impacts on public utilities and the utility infrastructure of the Tampa Bay area is really very significant. And this is probably the most important outcome of this otherwise irrelevant archaeological research. So to communicate this, we have convened since 2010 a series of workshops for urban planners and county governments, and we call it Resilient Tampa Bay. And every year we get together for a 2 or 3 day conference, and we tell them what our research results are to date, what the threat matrices look like, and kind of remind them a little bit about, hey, this is the value of cultural and historical analysis. It really matters. It really can make a difference. It really can shape our understanding of future environmental threats and environmental challenges in the Tampa Bay area with regard to the resiliency of this community. We are doing the same thing. We have at these other research sites in Mexico and Honduras and Belize, and we're trying to understand the way that tourism and tourism development is impacting the resiliency of these communities in these same kind of terms. So we're doing sediment cores and reconstructions and all these kinds of things to try to arrive at the same place for these other communities. All right, very quickly, I know I'm really short on time. The last example that I'll mention is what we're doing with regard to this notion of urban metabolism and model building. And these projects are funded by an NSF Ultra X grant. I think this stands for Urban Long-Term Research Area Exploratory Grant, and the NSF PIRE program. My colleagues and I have been working with partnerships in international research and education to bring these same kind of modeling efforts to communities in the Caribbean. And so for this, we're working on developing a series of models. These are metabolism models that you might find in environmental engineering to evaluate the inputs and outputs in terms of resources and wastes in these urban environments, and what are the possibilities for interventions, and what are the possibilities for capacity building to deal with these kinds of threats and issues with resiliency. So one of our big questions we're asking now are, what are the ways in which urban development and water redistribution policies are driving wetland change in Tampa Bay? And this is a big picture issue that's relevant around here. It's relevant in Arizona and Nevada, and where people are, populations are growing so high that the demand on water and the demand on aquifers is increasing incredibly. So we're taking a look into that. We're dealing with, very quickly, we're dealing with 2 different conceptual models, and this is one of the challenges of doing interdisciplinary work, is working with fields that you're not really trained in, and you don't really speak their language, and so you have to merge different conceptual models about how to go about doing interdisciplinary research. And we sat down with us anthropologists sat down with environmental engineers and we said, okay, what is your conceptual model about how the Tampa Bay area works? And so this is what they told us. They used words like eutrophic and heterotrophic. What do these things mean? They had to explain to us how these systems work in terms of ecosystems and ecology. And then we, of course, explained our model. Social drivers of water policy impact water redistribution, and that has eco-hydrological consequences for the landscape that affect people's perceptions and behaviors that drive water policy. And you can see where this kind of loop continues. So we've created a sort of a hybrid conceptual model and framed a number of research questions from that. These are just a few examples. How do perceptions and values of change in freshwater habitats vary across the urban-rural gradient? How do relationships among different jurisdictions and stakeholders result in particular water policies? And then, important for the Tampa Bay area, how do forested wetlands respond to these kinds of water policies? And this is just one example of some of the research results that are emerging right now. We are looking particularly at people's perceptions who live around wells that are drilled into the aquifer versus people's perceptions who live in more urban environments where we're not drilling wells. And to what extent does your geographic location of residence impact your values and beliefs and ideals about water issues and water policy? And where do policymakers live? Geographically, where do our policymakers live? And we're finding that they do not live in the well fields. They're not directly affected by it on a daily basis. And so they have a very different conception about water redistribution policies, simply based on area of residence, what they come in contact with on a daily basis. And so to model all of this, we started using VenSim. I don't know if people are using it here, but this is a complex system simulation software that's really very cool. What you do is arrange terms or ideas in interesting configurations, like these conceptual models we've been coming up with. What influences what? And to each term or configuration, you can assign either a mathematical equation, some kind of algorithm, or you can input data directly into the model. You can use regression equations, principal component data, eigenvectors and eigenvalues, and you end up with a really complex system that you can run simulations on. This is one that we're in the middle of developing, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how complex these are. One of our questions is the extent to which people will adopt new technologies to deal with water problems and water issues. And so we have a very simple looking model, but you can see if you just follow one term, adoption rate is influenced by many other factors. And if you just pull out one of these other factors, adoption probability, here's adoption probability, that one in itself is influenced by many other factors. And if you just pull out perceived benefit, that one in itself is influenced by many other factors. So the value of this kind of modeling is you can really start to identify feedback loops in complex systems, and you can identify specifically the terms or ideas or factors that don't matter as much. I mean, with limited time and money and resources, we can only attack so many issues and problems. So this really helps you to identify the salient characteristics of complex systems that can give you the most bang for your buck, essentially. And so we're in the middle of collecting data on health benefits, on capacity building, on who are the actual adopters of technology and who are the possible adopters of technology. And this is a long-term research project over the next 5 years. And we're starting to convene the same kinds of geofocal research groups and workshops annually. And we've just joined UN Habitat for Humanity Cities of the Future initiative that brings together other people around the world that are doing these same kinds of modeling efforts in one place a year so that we can have the kinds of discussions and conversations, not just among ourselves as people in academia, but with policy makers, with urban planners and urban designers, so that we can share that kind of information and learn to speak each other's language. So our next big conference is in 2014 called Green Infrastructure Conference. We're going to be focusing on green technologies that urban environments can do to deal with water distribution issues. And a lot of this follows on that kind of model building where we're able to identify what those salient characteristics are. So I will just close. I found this thing called a Wordle, a word cloud. I love these things. I'm learning these things from my students all the time. And I put in one of my NSF grant proposals. and this is what popped up. I think I overused the word human. It really helps you self-analyze what kind of junk you're writing about. So the size of the text is the frequency with which the word's used in the document. So, but I'll just use this to close and to say that there are, I hope I've shown you some benefits to incorporating cultural and historical analysis into scientific research, interdisciplinary research, that can be used for research-based policy, particularly in the area of sustainable development. A lot of benefits to recognizing the long-term nature of a lot of these human environmental phenomena, and into incorporating people's perceptions and values that really often drive policy in ways that we can't imagine. And then plenty of challenges that have come about in doing this research. We're not trained to be interdisciplinary scientists and to work with other groups. That's why we have these siloed conditions often at universities. So coming to a project like this, you have to learn to speak their language. You have to learn to be friends with people who are socially very different than you are. And so it's a great challenge. But in the end, if you can get the synergy worked out just right, I think there are a lot of payoffs to this kind of research. Well, I again thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, and I'm happy to take any questions you have. Thank you.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions. We will be finishing pretty much at time, about 1 o'clock. So.
Let me have it. Yes, sir.
You know, systems that are circular like that, where it's self-feeding itself, how do you decide where to best input effort to make any real change occur when it's feeding upon itself?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges, is looking at trying to model really complex systems and then try to identify the parts of the systems where you can make a real difference. And a lot of this, because it's modeling, are conceptual models, is looking at probabilities and analyzing probabilities of occurrences. So we try to input different data and run different simulations to try to identify what are the parts of those models that we really need to focus on. But it's not easy, and you can see, because it's a model, it's data dependent. It depends on the data that you put in. If you put in junk, you'll get junk out. And so that's one of the real values of working in big interdisciplinary teams. We can put up the entire model, and we have, on a wall, and everybody take a piece of it and everybody look at it and start having conversations. The most important thing that's come from that particular model is not any of the results of the simulation, but the conversations it's forced us to have as scientists and researchers. And it's really shaped our research in different ways. So it looks fancy, but it's kind of a conversation piece. You had a question, yeah.
Yeah, how are policymakers responding to this research, especially in terms of infrastructure? I know Floridians are very tied to their coastal.
Oh, yes, very much so. We have had really fantastic participation and reception, and we every year generate a list of our top 10 recommendations and executive summaries and make those available. The biggest challenge we found in implementing specific decisions from these from the research that we've done is that a lot of policymakers are only in office for a couple of years. And so just to the point where we've reached them and convinced them of the importance, they get voted out or they leave and a new group comes in, and we have to start those conversations all over again. So that's a dynamic that we're starting to deal with, and we're trying to come up with ways to have more permanence. The best way so far that we found is by working with county and city government staff. The staff are legacies, and they really do most of the work anyway. But by getting to the staff, you really get things on the agenda, and there's much lower turnover of staff than there are policymakers. So, but it's not easy. Yes, ma'am.
Based on the research that you've done so far, do you think there is a solution to climate change, or in a negative sense?
Well, no. It changes all the time. It always has. It always will. It might not be changing in the way that we would like, but certainly one of the things that we've come away with in doing this kind of research is a realization, at least for policymakers, that we have to take a two-pronged approach. One is mitigation, and mitigate the adverse impacts that we're having on the environment. But another is realizing it's going to happen whether you like it or not. So we need adaptive strategies to adapt to these changes. So it's really convincing urban planners and policymakers that it has to be mitigative and adaptive measures together. And it's figuring out what the balance of those two that's the real trick, because as anthropologists know, one city culture is very different from another city culture. So there's no model that's going to work for everyone. And so we have to work piecemeal in these kinds of regions. But yes, climate will continue to change with us or without us. Yes, sir.
I'm a natural resource sociologist, and my work these days has to do with adaptive capacity of human communities and wildfire threat. One of the challenges I found in working in these natural human coupled systems teams is the language problem is worse between the social scientists and the biophysical scientists than it is between social scientists and policymakers. The positivistic assumptions that many biophysical scientists bring to these things, the idea of case studies being generalizable theoretically is foreign to them. And so it seems to me that there's some real challenges here to get beyond the positivism, the sort of radical positivism that many biophysical scientists bring to the table.
Yeah.
You must have faced these same challenges. I don't know if you have any insights into
I have no insights, no. I'm just an anthropologist. Early on, I was put on grants after they've already been written and developed as the token anthropologist, and realized quickly that my ability to be effective at doing anything was pretty nil because of that. And now we've discovered together that we all have to start working on grant proposals and research ideas together from the very, very start in order to have the kinds of really robust models and epistemologies that are amenable to both kinds of biological or physicalist models of science. So that's a big move ahead. It was long to get there, but we finally realized that. And then the other issue that we've been up against is communicating the research results. A lot of the biological scientists were not that amenable to giving lectures in front of audiences, to working directly with policymakers, particularly when a lot of the grant programs don't fund outreach and don't fund communication of your results. So you have to come up with really creative ways to share those kinds of research results. And you have to have a really good, creative core group of faculty and students. But no, I have no insights for you.
Well, that's slightly sad now.
Oh, well.
We have to bring an end to the proceedings. Before you all leave, I would just like to publicly acknowledge everyone who's co-sponsored this event. That's the Anthropology Graduate Organisation, the Department of Anthropology, and the College of Arts and Sciences. So if you could join me now in thanking our speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.